If I had to say the single most important or most significant disruptor of female hormonal balance in today's world, it is absolutely stress. Those stress hormone pathways disrupt normal function of our biochemistry, and they certainly start to fiddle with our hormones.
Welcome to Midlife Unfiltered, a podcast about unapologetically embracing the season of me as we live the lives we want in midlife and beyond. I'm Anita McLachlan.
I'm Erica Webb. We're here to make some noise, say hell no to outdated stereotypes, and hell yes to living life on our terms. Hey Anita, how are you?
Erica, I'm doing really well. How are you?
I'm great. And I know that we are both so excited about today's guest. Before we hit record, you were just telling our wonderful guest how you did a little happy dance when she said yes to this interview. And I can attest to how excited you were, and me as well. This feels like an absolute treat.
Absolute
really
treat
does.
and a big privilege. And I know women are going to learn so much from this conversation.
Absolutely. So let me introduce our wonderful guest without further ado. So we are joined today by Dr. Karen Coates, and Karen is an integrative medical doctor and naturopathic physician. She has degrees in medicine and surgery and postgraduate qualifications in obstetrics and gynecology, nutritional and environmental medicine. Whew. She's an advocate for self-responsibility in health and helps women take control of their own health through her work and her book, and I believe more things on the way. So welcome, Karen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Anita and Erica. It's just a delight to be here.
It's awesome. Did we miss anything in that intro? Anything that you want to add that we should know about you, Dr. Karen, before we dive in?
Perhaps the only other thing that I've deep dived into in the last almost decade is an area of medicine called nutrigenomics, and I've done further postgraduate studies in that. And essentially, what that is, it's looking at how your food and your genetics speak to one another, and how your lifestyle will impact your ability to be well, based on the genes that you accidentally inherited from mum and dad. So I've been using that more and more in my practice and in my research since I actually sort of delved into that little rabbit hole.
That sounds fascinating. I would love to know more about that. We'll see if we can weave that into, Anita. That sounds incredible. All right, I'm going to throw over to you, Anita, and we're going to dive in.
Yeah, thanks, Erica. And thank you again, Dr. Karen. We are talking about the disruption in season 2 of this podcast. And for us, when we mention the word disruption in midlife, menopause is like the number one topic that seems to come up. And I think also because it's a topic that is still shrouded in a lot of confusion for women. There are certain terms that are used, certain feelings and symptoms. I'm a bit wary of the word symptom too, because it makes it sound like a disease, and I know we don't have a disease when we have menopause, menopausal symptoms. So I think if we could maybe start with how you would like to explain the menopause transition for women, that would be a really good place to start.
I think if we go back, and I'm going back to when I started in women's health in the 90s, and there was a book that I read, and interestingly, my co-author Sharon Colker read that same book at the same time. It was called What Your Doctor May Not Tell You About Menopause, and it was by a very enlightened integrative doctor called Dr. John Lee. And he introduced the idea of progesterone being an important hormone for women as they move through not only their fertile years, but also into that age of transition with the menopause and beyond. And I started to look at the women who are coming through my office door in a completely different light. It was almost like an aha moment when I started to go back to basic biochemistry about what these two major hormones for women do. The estrogen, which we hear a lot about, and in fact, it's almost like the only conversation that we have when we're talking about menopause, and progesterone, which is a far more user-friendly hormone for women. And we're just starting to scratch the surface when we look at how essential it is for women even beyond the menopausal transition into what we call the age of wisdom, not post-menopause. So I am officially in the age of wisdom. So when we're looking at the terminology that's thrown around at the moment, what we have is a relatively new term, which is the perimenopause. And I think that was an important creation for women because it actually allowed women to talk about the changes that happen before they officially given their badge of menopause. And literally, if you look at what menopause is from a medical perspective, the clinical definition of menopause occurs on one day, and that's 12 months after your last period happened. And sometimes we combine that with a little blood test that looks at the FSH, or the follicle stimulating hormone, being a little high. So that one day is menopause. Before menopause, there's all sorts of hormonal havoc can come into a woman's life, and that's what we now term the perimenopause. And I've been treating perimenopause, except I haven't labelled that, since the 1990s. And if we look at what happens in that perimenopause, that lead up to menopause, where you stop having periods, it's all about what happens to progesterone and what happens to progesterone at a particular time in a woman's late 30s, early 40s, or into their 50s. And what Sharon and I came up with when we started to research for our new book, which is all about the woman's hormonal journey, is that menopause and perimenopause is almost like the opposite of puberty. When we go through puberty, estrogen wakes up and it creates breast buds, and then it starts to create the menstrual cycle. And then along comes progesterone. And once progesterone and estrogen starts to dance beautifully in puberty, then a young girl goes through and has normal menstrual cycles from there on through the reproductive life. At the other end of our life, when we're looking at perimenopause, what happens is the progesterone starts to deplete. And in an ideal world, that should happen the day before we go through menopause, in an ideal world, but it doesn't. It starts to deplete in some women in their late 30s. So they're basically losing one of those amazing essential female hormones at a much younger time than a lot of women who perhaps sort of slip through menopause without having many symptoms there. So the perimenopause is now a focus in mainstream medicine that I have to say integrative doctors have been focusing on it for the last 40 years. And we've been actually treating it quite well, I think, as well, because we've been looking at bioidentical hormones and progesterone being the star of the perimenopause, not the estrogen. So I think when we look at that perimenopause label, it creates the symptoms that we associate with menopause in the old term of menopause. And that's basically hot flushes, mood swings, brain fog, erratic periods that come and go, sometimes at will, and where there's never any reason for it. And I think that hormonal havoc has been a really hard thing for women in today's world to actually slot into their very, very busy and demanding life.
Absolutely. And it's almost like we don't have time for this, so can you just make it go away quickly, or, help me deal with it really quickly because I don't have time for this.
And
Yeah.
the risk of that is that mainstream medicine comes along and says, here are these hormones that we can give you and we can make your life go away. And I think that I've been around in this job for long enough to know that sometimes mainstream medicine gets it wrong. And we've had this sort of love-hate relationship, particularly with estrogen, since, well, forever. And I worry that our current push to say every single woman who starts having menopausal symptoms needs to go onto HRT is not going to end well for a lot of women. And the one thing that I think has been the take-home message that I've had from the research that I've done over the last year in preparation for the book is that it is damn confusing, even as a medical doctor who is a researcher, and that's my main job now. I look at the research that comes out of all of the women's studies that we've got available to us, and up until probably a few weeks ago, I was still trying to figure out how I can actually relay the message of, is HRT safe or not? And what are the risks and benefits in HRT for women? And it is by no means a clear discussion. So I think that that's the sort of thing that I'm still trying to figure out in my own mind as to, how do we present this as medical doctors to women to allow them to make an informed decision on whether hormone replacement therapy is the right choice for their set of symptoms as they move through their 40s into their 50s.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that you've mentioned that, because this is why we're leading the disruption conversation with you, because in our minds we wanted a holistic approach to this, and then we've also having conversations with a GP, who specializes in women's health, which gives us the traditional, I call it Western medicine. Maybe that's not the right terminology, but gives us that approach. And then we've also spoken to somebody who is more from the naturopathic epigenetics kind of side to give us the lifestyle influences and how we manage it that way, the non-HRT, if you like.
Yes.
So in our minds, it wasn't just, we wanted to present different ideologies, I guess, in a way, and different thinking on how to manage this transition in our lives, because everybody is different. Everybody's going to have a different context, a different appreciation. So thank you for mentioning that, because in our minds, you're an expert in the field that covers pretty much just about everything. So we wanted to start there. And that's the integrative medical approach, which you've talked about. Could we just maybe expand on that a little bit? Because that's a new term for many of the women listening to this podcast, I feel. Yeah.
Yes. And it's interesting when you sent through a little bit of information about explaining the difference between a functional practitioner, functional medical practitioner, and an integrative doctor. I hadn't actually thought of it in those terms before. And I think I dabble in a little bit of both. But as I've moved through my integrative medical career, I've tended to go more into the integrative doctor holistic area and less into the functional medicine part of it, where you look at the biochemistry, you try to deep dive down into the root cause of disease. And I think sometimes as doctors, we get a little bit arrogant about what we know, and we forget about this huge chasm of what we don't know. So when we start to fiddle with even vitamins and minerals and start to look at high dose B group vitamins, for example, there is always a price you pay when you exceed what nature says is that sweet spot for not too much, not too little of everything. And that includes vitamins, minerals, food, exercise, whatever. And I think we have to tread very carefully when we start to get into that biochemistry that's relatively new in medicine and think that we know everything about the root cause of a disease. Where I look at it as an older woman now, I look at the tradition of treating and helping people. And we so underestimate that natural world that actually can help us heal, but also can help us stay well. And I think that that's where I tend to go a little bit more now, having read, researched so much. I'm forever in awe of the power of food. And I think that if we're going to be well into the future, it's our dinner plate that's going to support longevity, not the current fad of pharmaceutical medicines. So, and I appreciate functional medicine, and I know and I understand it, but I always worry in the back of my mind when I start using something that's a lot bigger dose than nature provided for a human body. And I suppose that's my fundamental view on how pure functional medical doctors work compared to integrative medical doctors who look at the, sometimes thousands of years of history of using a particular herb or approach in people, and finding that it's survived the test of time, if I can put it like that. That, people aren't silly, and we forget how incredibly resourceful and intelligent our ancestors and our medical ancestors were when they started to use herbs and different remedies. And we're starting to now, because we've got that opportunity to research it, now we can understand why those herbs work, because we can see the active ingredient in it. And we're starting to actually see research that comes out of food sources that didn't happen when, 30 or 40 years ago, because nobody was paying for the research to begin with.
So as an integrative doctor, if I was to come to you with my concerns or with my symptoms, what would be your approach, just to give women a practical kind of appreciation of how your approach might be different to what they might get, say, going to their traditional GP, if you like?
Yeah. I think that time during a consultation is probably the most disruptive roadblock to actually getting what you need from your mainstream medical doctor. It's not that they don't want to talk about your diet and exercise and lifestyle issues. It's that they've got a whole pile of sick people sitting in that waiting room, waiting to be treated for acute medical diseases and chronic diseases, that time is of the essence. So I think that certainly is a difference between an integrative medical doctor's appointment, which by definition is more expensive because you've got that doctor's attention for at least half an hour and sometimes up to an hour of time. And what that does is it allows a doctor to look at all of the aspects of their lifestyle choices, their stress, their diet, and to start to put into place a picture of where the gaps are. And it doesn't take very long to figure out where the gaps are. If I had to say the single most important or most significant disruptor of female hormonal balance in today's world, it is absolutely stress, without even thinking about it. It's the stress that women are under today that didn't exist. If you transport us back a few generations into tribal life, yes, we had some challenges there, absolutely. And our modern world has overcome things like disease and infection as a cause of death. But it's given us this whole pile of worry. And it's also given us this worry that we never used to know about because it was happening on the other side of the mountain, and we didn't really worry about things that were happening on the other side of the mountain. Now we're worried about things that are happening on the other side of the world. And as much as we'd like to train our minds to cut that noise out, we can't. So it's in there feeding those stress hormone pathways in the same way a young woman would have been stressed by perhaps some tribal unrest in her village or in her valley where she was living. So I think that we're under a huge amount of stress because of the information overload, and it's always bad news. The minute you turn on the TV, it's never a good news story. So we're always processing that, and we're processing it from the minute we wake up to the minute we put our head on the pillow and try and go to sleep. So those stress hormone pathways disrupt normal function of our biochemistry, and they certainly start to fiddle with our hormones. And it's probably the single most important reasons why we lose both our libido hormone as we get older and stressed, and also our progesterone. And there's a very good biochemical reason of survival why that has to happen. The problem that we have in today's world, and particularly in Australia, is that there isn't a war, and we've got plenty of food and our life isn't threatened, but our brain doesn't know that. Our brain's still working on that ancient template of survival. And when you start to look at your to-do list of the day and you think, oh my God, I can't do it, it's so stressful, your brain says, this is an unsafe day, it's not a good day for this woman to be pregnant, let's just take away some of those hormones, and off goes progesterone. And then we're left with estrogen. And the estrogen is the thing that basically feeds those perimenopausal symptoms, those estrogen fluctuations where progesterone is sometimes present and sometimes not. So we've got to understand what's happening behind the scenes when we start to look at how disrupted our hormones are in today's extremely busy and very stressful world, and try and figure out ways of living in our life without it really impacting so much on our hormones and on our health.
Mm. I
And so
really appreciate that. Yeah. Sorry, keep going.
I think, sorry, to sort of finish off your question, I think I always start, I take a history of the person, the woman sitting in front of me in the room, but we almost always come back to the stress question by the end of that first consultation, because if we don't deal with that, it's such an overwhelming, powerful force in a woman's biochemistry that there's no way that that woman's going to get good results with hormonal balance if she doesn't look at how she's managing the stress in her life.
What an extraordinary message. Like that's just bullseye for me. Like and that's something that culturally we don't, it's messages that we're not often hearing, right? We're hearing just get on with it, suck it up, princess, and just get on with
Exactly.
life. But to actually put it in the context of stress and appreciate that unless you manage those levers, whatever you use as treatment is not going to be as effective. That's mind-blowing, really, and that's a key message to get across, isn't it, really?
It's a very key message. And I think one of the gifts of COVID, interestingly, when I look at, it was a horrendous time. But one of the things that disappeared with COVID was the idea of soldiering on. Just take the pharmaceutical medications when you've got a cold, soldier on, get back to work, infect everybody else in your workspace, and don't take time to heal. And I think that was a big message with COVID. And I'm hoping that we remember that message, because it's not just that, it's also the overwhelm of stress. I'll tell you an interesting story about my menopause. I started to have missed periods at around about 48. And then I was incredibly stressed. It was a time when I was working full time and my kids were still teenagers, and I was still sort of doing the mum and the full-time doctor thing. And I got to a stage where I knew I was up to here with stress. I hadn't had a period probably for almost 12 months. And I rang up my lovely friend Sharon, who at that stage was the general manager at Gwingana Health Retreat. And I blubbered away saying, I just need to come and just spend 5 days at Health Retreat. Anyway, she being a beautiful friend, she found a little spot for me, and I just slid in as a guest at Gwingana Health Retreat for a week's detox. On day 5 of that detox, I had my first period in almost 12 months.
Wow.
I then went back to life, and I was feeling really well because I'd had time out, I'd de-stressed. And I went through the next year, coming up to my 50th birthday, and I got to that stage again where I think it was kids at that time and, teenage boys and what have you. And I rang Sharon up and said, it's time, I've got to just, time out of life. And I went back to Gwingana and I had my second period. And it was about 9 months after my last stay. I had my second period at Gwingana, and that was it forever. So what the take-home message for me was, gee, I wonder whether I was actually in menopause or whether I was actually in stress, and that was what was stopping my hormones. But I really drove home the impact of stress on a woman's menstrual cycle.
That's
It occurs to me
incredible.
that that's often a very hard, it must be a hard message too, to like constantly be having to tell women, because it's not what women want, is it? It's like,
It's not. You don't want
that's,
to.
yeah.
It's almost like don't shoot the messenger to a large extent. But because we know this stuff, and I know this stuff not only from personal experience, but from talking to thousands of women over the course of my life. And if I don't tell them that, then I'm not doing them a service. But what happens then is I've got to then try and work through a solution with them, so that I'm not just giving them a problem and then sending them back off into the big wide world. I'm actually saying, well, this is what you need to do, and this is how you need to put the boundaries in place. And some women listen to that sooner than later, and other women will probably have to fall off the edge of their stress mountain before they actually say, oh gosh, yeah, Dr. Karen was right about
Maybe
that.
she was right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe she was right. Because a lot of the discussion is around sex hormones. You know, let's manage your estrogen and let's manage your testosterone and progesterone.
Mhm.
And we don't often talk about the stress hormones, you know, the impact of cortisol and insulin resistance, you know, the whole midlife midsection explosion, you know. So, and often, and we've even had these conversations, haven't we, Erica, where the talk is about estrogen and how that impacts our midlife midsection.
Yeah.
But I'm glad we're going here now because I've written in my notes, let's talk about insulin and cortisol as well. Are we able to do that just for a brief moment?
Yeah, sure. I think when we look at all of these hormones in a woman's body, they all talk to one another, and they all have a role to play that is fundamentally involved with reproduction and survival. So if you look at all of the hormones that float around a woman's body, they're aimed at either getting a woman pregnant or allowing her to survive bad times. And sometimes those two things will clash. What we have at the moment is a very different scenario when we're looking at the, I suppose, the ancient template of survival that was basically based on famines, war, and food supply shortages. And so what we've got now is this stress impact on a woman's life that has nothing to do with the availability of food. So she continues to eat. And that's not a bad thing, but there is a price to pay for that. And the fact that we now have different food that we will eat, and probably different choices when we're stressed. And then we start to impact on what we call the survival switch. And there's this interesting theory of what happens, and I'll stick with women. When a woman gets stressed, there are changes that happen in her brain that have to do with, interestingly, the uric acid cycle that, again, doesn't get much play at all. But it's a little bit like a hibernation switch that allows us to store food as if we were going into hibernation for the winter, and in the same way as bears do during their winter season, to eat and store sugar and then survive the actual famine that we think we're in. And that hunt for sugar is printed into our DNA. The difference between the hunt for sugar back in tribal life was berries and fruit. It was not the local supermarket with all of those beautiful red and orange lollies that sit there saying, eat me, buy me, buy me. So we're actually feeding our bodies some really nasty stuff when it comes to messing with then our insulin and our blood sugar. And what we then have is the insulin and the cortisol and the testosterone all getting together and having a little powwow about how they're going to save this woman from the impending drought, famine, war. And so that sets off a series of cascading consequences that ends up with us building a larder. And the best place to put a larder is right around the middle. And what our bodies can do is build that larder even if there is no food coming through or very little food coming through, because what our bodies have the ability to do is to turn down our basal metabolic rate, our basal metabolism, and it's a little bit like our internal fuel. So the calories that we eat when we have a meal, we spend some on movement, we spend some on digestion, and the rest of those calories on that plate for that day is spent feeding our internal basal metabolism, our metabolic fire. And that's the stuff that keeps our body temperature at 37 degrees. You can imagine how much that would cost if we had to plug our bodies into an electrical grid to get 37 degrees all the time, 24/7 forever. So that's a lot of energy that comes from our plate on our food. And I think what people don't realize is that 70% of that food goes into the basal metabolic rate. And there's only 20, maybe 25% that's spent on movement, and then 10% on digesting the food. So if you start to, as a woman, fiddle and turn down that basal fire, even if it's only 5%, it's a hell of a lot less food that they can eat without actually storing as fat. So if we've got a little bit of food still left on our plate, and in today's world, it's a woman on a diet, she's cut her calories down to 800 calories a day forever, thinking that that's going to cause a release of this fat that's absorbed around the middle. But if her basal metabolic rates turn down at the same time, all that will happen is that she'll actually start to store more fat, because your body will say, oh my gosh, there's only 800 calories coming in today. This drought and famine is getting so bad that we've got to save this woman's life. So we're going to turn that basal metabolism down even more and store more food for the rainy day that's coming. And the problem is it never comes in Australia. Particularly, we've always got some food. We might choose not to eat it, but we've always got some available to us. So when we look at the old way of looking at the calorie in, calorie out balance of what determines your body weight, it's completely defunct. It's got nothing to do with it. And even more so as a woman moves through menopause, because we listen more carefully to that survival message. And we do that because we're no longer a desirable or an important member of the tribe. If you think of it on a purely evolutionary business, if you're in a famine and there's no food, who's the most expendable member of that tribe? And it's the older women who can't reproduce and can't fight. So it's hardwired into us to actually be more efficient as we age at storing our own food so that we can survive the drought and become the wise women of the tribe and pass on that knowledge through the generations. So nature's given us a fix. The problem is nature didn't bet on the 21st century and the availability of our instant sugars and our food as literally a 24/7 thing. So that's where we've come unstuck, and we can't rely on those old messages of, well, you're obviously fat because you've been eating too much. It just doesn't make sense on any level of research now, given our current level of understanding of how the insulin and the testosterone and the cortisol talk to one another.
That's so fascinating. It's the context of the modern world with an ancient makeup, I guess,
A template of survival, and that template has not changed over hundreds of thousands of years. We still talk to our genes in the same way. It's our environment that's changed, but our genes haven't caught up with that yet.
Yeah, and I think that's another key message that we don't often hear and don't hear often enough, is that we're living in an ancient, body within a different, totally different context than what it's ever. And there's a big gap. There's a big gap. There's big gaps everywhere. That's what I'm discovering in going down many rabbit holes about women's health, in that, research hadn't included women, we're largely regarded as mini men.
Yes.
And what we're given to help us with our ailments, to the fact that, menopause is regarded as a disease and it's something that has to be treated as such. And then there's gaps in what our medical teams are taught, and unless you go to somebody who has spent extra time in understanding women's health, and in particular that there's going to be even more gaps. I mean, I've struck it recently in my own story with my bone health, and an endocrinologist who basically said, we didn't talk about hormones and the impact of hormones in your menopause transition because you didn't show any symptoms. And I'm thinking, wow, okay. I'll only give you something if I can see that you're showing signs
Yes.
of being out of balance. And I'm thinking, but this is natural for me. I'm a woman and I'm going to be going through this, irrespective of how that might show up for you to see, right? So, can we just touch on these gaps? And maybe there's some big gaps that you want women to know about so that, we're all about arming women with the right questions, or not to be afraid to ask the questions of
Yeah.
their health team.
I think there are a lot of things that need to go on a woman's checklist in their early 40s, and they involved things like being proactive about breast health, about bone health, particularly, about muscle mass, because that is a gift. If we can get our muscle mass up, we start modulating our blood sugars better, and we certainly start to build better bones that will then hopefully see us through a menopause. But we've got to also look at our risk benefit for that. What we know now is a very narrow gap in time where, if we do choose to have hormone replacement therapy, now called menopause hormone therapy, we've got a relatively brief window of opportunity to make that decision and get maximum benefit with minimal risk associated with it.
Right.
And that's the sort of stuff that I've had to get my head around with regard to what we're doing now. And can I say that when we're looking at menopause, we do have to look at not only symptom of menopause that may require some hormone treatment, but we've also got to look at a woman's overall general risk benefit with regard to breast health and bone health. And one of the things that we now know, that again, I'm going to blow the trumpet of integrative medical doctors, we've known it since the early 90s, or probably even the late 80s, is that bioidentical hormones are far safer for women than synthetic hormones. And thank goodness my mainstream medical colleagues are now using bioidentical hormones. They also realise, which integrative medical doctors have been doing for 40 or 50 years, that oral bioidentical hormones are not any good, that they actually are either broken down by the liver and create a problem with getting levels up in the blood, or they're more likely to cause the side effects of hormone replacement therapy, like deep vein thromboses and increased risk of stroke. But if we give bioidentical hormones in either a transdermal or what we call a transbuccal, so in a lozenge that's dissolved in the mouth, then we actually minimize the risk of those parts of the estrogen replacement therapy. So the current state of affairs is that if we choose at 12 months around when we go through menopause to have estrogen replacement therapy, we can perhaps a tiny bit reduce our risk of breast cancer, but there's we're still out on that one. We minimize if we use the transdermal or the transbuccal mode. We don't increase the risk so much of gallbladder disease, stroke, and deep vein thrombosis. But if we start to or continue to give oral estrogen, then that risk is quite high. And in my world, it's unacceptable because there's a very acceptable compromise there. Transdermal, transbuccal. And what integrative medical doctors have been doing, and I think our mainstream medical colleagues don't appreciate how clever and how well trained doctors are, is that when we use bioidentical progesterone, which we've been doing for 40 years, that we actually monitor the levels of progesterone to make sure that it's enough to balance out the estrogen in that hormone replacement therapy during menopause. And one of the things I worry about is that the oral progesterone that is now being used by mainstream medicine, and it's amazing that we've got that called Prometrium. It's an oral tablet of progesterone and it's not well absorbed. and it doesn't give the same amount of hormone in the blood that the transdermal or the transbuccal, the lozenge does. So I think that we have to make sure that we're all on the same page when we're looking at, our focus is on women's health. Our focus is on giving women hormones that they may need to either support their transition through menopause, to minimize the hot flushes, minimize the bladder stuff, and to improve brain function through that menopausal change, and to keep them safe from the side effects of the treatment that we're giving them. And what's the best way to keep them safe? And by far, it's giving them either transdermal or transbuccal hormones that are bioidentical. So our bodies use it, accept it as if it was made by
It's
their own
their own.
bodies. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've had many a heated argument going back into the 90s and early 2000s with fairly well-known Australian endocrine specialists about how I was going to do this and that to the women who I was treating. And I challenge them now to say that I did any harm, because the information that we have out now was that trans buckle, the atrocious that we used, was exactly the right treatment to minimise risk and to maximise benefit for women who are going through that menopausal change. So I just like, I think, our mainstream colleagues to give our integrative medical doctors a little bit more recognition for our skill, our expertise, and our ability to stay in evidence-based medicine.
Yeah.
So there's my little soapbox for the day.
Oh, we all love getting on our soapbox for various things. That's absolutely fine. No, I think that's great. What's coming up for me now is, if there are women listening to this conversation who might not have heard of integrative medicine before and think, oh, I'd like to understand more about that, what should they do?
Not all integrative medical doctors are skilled to provide hormone replacement. I think that if you're looking for an integrative medical doctor, do some homework. One of the things that we recommend in our book is to perhaps contact a local compounding pharmacy that has a good reputation in town and ask them for a list of their doctors that actually do a lot of compounding and use bioidentical hormones, because obviously the doctors who are sending more scripts in are actually more experienced and good at what they do. So I think just check on the credentials, and that goes for, you know, even if it's a GP, it doesn't matter what your focus is. If you need to make sure that the credentials of that doctor are what you need. And this is where a busy GP is not the right person to ask about bioidentical hormones if it's not in their lane, if it's not their special interest. So I think that that's the first take-home message. The second take-home message that I think women need to get is that when we look at the risks of hormone replacement therapy, and particularly long-term, beyond, say, 2 to 5 years, the increased risk of breast cancer is still there. And it's worse in women who have underlying chronic health conditions because their bodies are already inflamed. And one of the things that all women can do to minimise their risk of breast cancer into the future is to look at their relationship with alcohol, because it's frightening to see the increased risk of breast cancer with alcohol. And honestly, any woman who comes to me and says, look, I'm really worried about the risk of breast cancer with hormones, I'd say, well, stop drinking and then take the hormones, and your risk is still lower than it was when you were drinking.
Before.
So, you know, it's putting risk into perspective, I think, and looking at choices that can minimise the risk of breast cancer particularly, because that's a big hormonal hurdle for women. And what you can do on a practical basis to, you know, really mitigate that risk. And the other thing is to look at your phytoestrogen foods, those estrogen foods that allow our bodies to actually mitigate the negative effect of our natural estrogen or our hormonal replacement estrogen on our breast tissue. And they're foods that we know traditionally are soy-based foods, but it's also your garlic, your vegetable-based foods, your flaxseed. Flaxseed is a super food when it comes to breast health. So there are a lot of things that women can do, both food-wise, even more so than supplement, that will mitigate their risk of breast cancer, keep their breasts healthy, and then they can look at hormone replacement as, okay, well, I've reduced my overall risk.
Right.
Maybe my quality of life would be better if I looked at hormone replacement for a couple of years to get me over the hump. And that's infinitely doable. And sometimes I sit there and I say, okay, well, how many glasses of alcohol do you take? And they say, oh, well, no more than 2 a day. I say, okay, here's 2 a day. If I take away 1.5 of those and give you estrogen, you've still got a lower risk of breast cancer. So, it's looking at how you use that information as a woman. And it's not easy to get that information, because it did my brain in trying to actually quantify, the effect of alcohol, the effect of sugar, and the effect of estrogen, and how that plays out in a woman's body, and particularly in her breasts. So it's looking at all of those things that increase risk, and working on the things that you've got infinite control over. And that certainly is your daily alcohol intake and what you put in your mouth.
Yeah, we do have control. And that was an awakening for me. So I was that woman. I was having, 2 glasses of wine with meals, with my dinner, probably 5 out of 7 nights a week. And since giving that up, I feel like a different person. A lot of my aches and pains and things that I was experiencing in that perimenopausal phase just disappeared. And so now I've learned just through making that one change, what a huge difference. Now, I haven't quantified that I get my breasts checked, so the flow-on effects there, but as a body and as a woman, I feel so much better for it.
I think that one of the things that take-home messages that I've always given when I've talked about menopause with a group of women is, if you are in that phase where you're going through perimenopause and you're having hot flushes, if you drink alcohol, you will flush. Your liver has to decide on that day whether it's going to recycle hormones for you and give you back a little bit of estrogen from the day, or whether it has to say, no, let's just let estrogen go out the back door and into the gut. And we've got to deal with this terrible toxin that we call alcohol. And your body will always choose the path that's going to keep you safer. So it doesn't matter that you're hot flush. It's got to get rid of those toxic byproducts of your alcohol for the day. And you will pay a price in hormonal balance with that. And I think we pay a little bit of a higher price than we realise we do as women. And we're just starting to see the evidence of that.
Yeah. Do you, in your decades of helping women through this stage of life, are there any bits of information that you want them to know, like that women might come to you and think one thing, but then really they need to be thinking another? So, you've touched on some of those things already in terms of being aware of what you put in your mouth and, what you drink and that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are some myths that they walk into your office with
Yeah.
that you would like to bust here and now, because we're about myth busting too, aren't we, Erica?
Good. I think there's 2 things that come to mind. I'll speak about the first one, which is the exercise component, and then I'm going to go on to vitamin D. Just remind me about the vitamin D in case my brain doesn't hold that space. When I was younger and working in a little bit more of a mainstream practice, but still integrative practice on the Gold Coast, I had under my wing a group of young elite athletes that were given to me as an association with the Australian Institute of Sport. And these were our Olympic athletes in the endurance sports. And they came to the Gold Coast because that was the beautiful climate to train and to work. So these triathletes, marathon runners, and long distance canoeists I also had under my wing. They were incredibly genetically blessed women, and they were incredibly stressed physically. because of the overtraining that they put on their body in order to achieve their goals, which was, personal best, world record, or Olympic gold for Australia. And one of the young women who came in to see me, and she still remains a friend to this day, she came in and she said, my periods are really all over the place, and I need to get them sorted because the Olympics is coming up. And I said, okay, well, we looked at various options. And she said, I told my coach that I was having trouble with periods, and he told me that if I was still having periods, that I wasn't training hard enough. And I stopped and I let that sink in, and I thought, well, and it was obviously a male. I thought, what are we doing to our young people in that sort of an attitude can be accepted as okay? So we worked on her hormones, and she actually ended up winning Olympic gold for Australia. But one of the things that beautiful group of women taught me, two things. One is vitamin D, but the other is that these women who were in endurance sports were a little bit old for their stated age because of the wear and tear on their body and the increased physical stress on their bodies. And every single one of them had retired from that sport in their mid-30s. Now, we fast forward to a woman who comes in who's 42, and she tells me, I've decided to take up marathon running because I want to, I think that's going to be a healthy choice for me. And for all of those women out there who are in their 40s and starting to worry about perimenopause and symptoms, if you start to look at endurance sports as your chosen health exercise option, it is doomed to fail. And I think that that's something that women don't get the message enough of. It's one of those things that when we start to look at where ideal exercise, ideal movement is, it's not too much, not too little. And most of us are not genetically programmed to do those high intensity, long, stretched out endurance sports like triathlons and marathons. And my advice to young women is, if it's on your bucket list and you're hormonally well, then make sure you set yourself up for success, do it, tick it off your bucket list, and then move on to something that's more conducive to wellness. And that's not long distance anything. So, and I know that I upset a lot of people with that. And about 10 years ago, I upset one of my dearest friends who is really, she's an incredibly fit woman. She's now in her late 50s. And I always said, you're going to run into trouble. And she contacted me several weeks ago and she said, I've been diagnosed with low bone density. And I just had to hold my voice. I was sort of almost going to say, well, I told you so. But I thought, no, I have to be a little bit more supportive of this woman. I said, oh. So obviously your exercise was not conducive to, supporting your bones. And it's because you have to just get it right. So I think that the take-home message there is balanced exercise is great, but if you push it beyond that common sense point, that there will be a price to pay. Unless you're perhaps born on the African subcontinent and you have the genetics of somebody who thrives on long distance anything. And there are some women in the world who are like that. But for most of us, if we're a European descent and we try to do those really hardcore endurance sports into our 40s, we will pay a price. And it will either be bone density, hormonal havoc, or whatever. The other thing that I learned from my beautiful group of women, when I checked their vitamin D levels, these were young women who were leading a very natural life outdoors. So they were swimming, cycling, running in the outdoors. And their vitamin D levels, the lowest I ever recorded was 110, and she wasn't on vitamin D. The highest I ever recorded was 180. And the woman who recorded 110, you think gold medal. The woman who recorded 180 units, think Hawaiian Ironman podium 3 times in her professional career. She's now retired. So as an integrative doctor, I look at the potential for women leading a more natural life than we are, achieving a natural level of vitamin D of between 110 and 180. And I look at what you see printed on your results page when you get your vitamin D levels checked in your mainstream medical doctor. 50 to 120 if you're down in Melbourne, 50 to 150 if you're in Queensland. And honestly, if you are sitting at 60 when you hit menopause, you will lose bone density at a much faster rate than somebody who is at 80 when she actually walks through that door of menopause and closes it forever. So I'd like to perhaps send women to a particular website. It's called grassroots.org. And it's a website that's run by an international panel of endocrine specialists, epidemiologists, and medical doctors that are Harvard-based, Stanford-based, British-based, that basically say that if you're not touching 100, up to about 150, but I'd stretch that to 180, you are not giving vitamin D to everything that you need to use vitamin D for in your body. So the rule of thumb for anybody who comes to see me, I say hug 100, that's your minimum, and no more than 180, because I know that it's possible to get that if you're leading a more natural life than we are. And I think that if you do just that, as you move through menopause, you're going to lead a longer and healthier life into your age of wisdom.
So that range is at infinitum, or are you saying that infinitum? So leading in for perimenopause and postmenopausally as well.
As we age, we need to support those pathways more. So our vitamin D, and this was actually a new discovery for me, because I had a question in my mind. I thought, what the hell vitamin D does all this stuff? What it does is vitamin D is like the conductor of your genetic orchestra. Vitamin D goes into your cells, finds your DNA, finds the epigenetic layer of control, and then starts to say, turn that gene on. Yes, up a little bit, and turn that gene off. It actually conducts the orchestra of your epigenetic control of your genes. That's super important. And that's why it has a finger in the pie of every single disease that we've got written into the medical books.
Wow. Thank you for that, Jem. And I've also heard that, absorption of calcium. So it's D with K2.
Correct. Yeah, D with K2.
So do we need our K2 levels? If D is right up there, is that enough?
Yeah. I think what you've got to make sure is you eat the calcium-rich foods, the vitamin K-rich foods, and your vitamin D-rich foods. The problem is that vitamin D-rich foods are foods that Australians don't like to eat, like their lamb's brains and
organs
and organ meats, and mushrooms. Mushrooms are extremely high in vitamin D. Mushrooms. And if you buy your locally farmed mushrooms and you put them out in the sun for an hour before you put them into the fridge, they actually give you more vitamin D when you eat them. So vitamin D, brilliant in mushrooms. But I think that's one of the things that I supplement with, and I don't take very many, but because I've got a European skin, I can't go out into our very harsh Australian sun. And I think if you eat your green leafy vegetables, you're going to be getting enough vitamin K. So that tends to not be a problem with deficiencies as much as vitamin D is, because we're listening to the sun message, and we live in Australia and we can't get much sun.
Yeah, that melanoma message, isn't it? It's like cover up,
and we can't ignore that, because we're Europeans living in a really, really harsh environment. And I know when I go to the south of France and I spend a bit of time there, and I'm actually taking a group of women over there in March of next year, I can sit on a beach in the Mediterranean with one layer of sunscreen in the morning. I can stay there for 8 hours without reapplying, and the next day I haven't even turned red, let alone burnt. It is a completely different sun. Whereas here on Kira Beach, if I was to look at what I do on the Gold Coast, it would be 3 minutes max out there on the midday beach, and I would be covering up
You'd
and
be fried.
slathering myself. So it's a different sun. So we've just got to be mindful of that.
Well, that's brilliant. Thank you for that. That's a huge gem. It certainly is for me, and I know it will be for others. I really appreciate that. Um, is there anything as I feel like we're coming to a natural close in the discussion. Thank you for all of that wisdom. I know Eric has been furiously writing notes, which is fantastic. Is there anything that you want to empower women with? Because we're on that mission, right? We want women to be their own health advocates because of those gaps, because of a lot of confusing, conflicting information, to be able to navigate through all of that confusion and go, this is what feels right for me. How do I find the right team for me? So any
Yeah,
passing
and I think
thoughts?
that's exactly right. I think it's a matter of finding the right team, and that can be an integrative doctor along with your GP. It can be a specialist and a gynecologist who has a special interest in hormone replacement therapy. But if you go to a specialist, they're going to prescribe hormones for you. So you have to have actually made that decision before you walk down that path. But they're really good at monitoring hormones because that's their job. So you can have a lot of people on your team, but I think that if you look at what you've got on your dinner plate, it's going to keep you more healthy than anything that you can look at in either the medical arena at all. And the other thing I think that they're totally underestimated is a good traditional Chinese medical practitioner who also practices acupuncture and an experienced naturopath. And sometimes they can be one and the same person. That sometimes you just got to have both on your team and use them as you need to.
So a multidiscipline team with with different expertise. Yeah, I love that. I must admit that's core to my team too. And my team is about to change because I've decided that one team member is not serving me well, so I'm going to be looking for another.
And I think that's really important to be able to sack your team members if they're not. And this is another take-home message to women who have had to navigate that breast cancer path, is that if a member of your medical team causes you high anxiety whenever you have an interaction with them, they're not the right person for you. They're not your person. And don't be afraid to sack them because you are the most important person on that team, not their ego. And I've struggled with that with a few patients over the last few years to actually get them to the stage where they're okay about, hurting a doctor's feelings because they're not the right person for them on their team.
Yeah, so important. Erica, is there anything that you would like to cover off? You're sitting very patiently and quietly. I know you'd love to listen. So is there
I do.
anything that you would like to add or ask?
There's one little thought that just keeps popping up into my mind, which is more of a share than anything, but see if it triggers anything for you, Karen. I guess I'm sitting here at 41 years old, and so I am probably in perimenopause. And if not already, I'm sure that's coming for me. And what I'm noticing as you're talking and as I'm listening is I do feel a little overwhelmed. And I'm noticing in my body that feeling of like, oh shit, there's not one right answer. Damn it.
I
And
know.
and it's funny because I am the kind of person, and Anita knows this, that, I'm very curious. I'm very open to there not being one answer. I very much believe that that's not the case. And I work as a counselor. And so I work with women all the time around, self-trust and all of these sort of softer skills that can be really tricky. And it occurs to me that that anxiety is a really big piece of this, of being like, I don't want to get it wrong. I don't want to get it wrong. I want to make sure I'm doing the right things. So is it, and I don't want to open a huge can of worms because I can see the time and realize that, we probably need to let you go. But I am just curious, is it the right team that helps to sort of manage that anxiety and that fear, I guess, around doing it right? Or is there something else that you would add to that?
No, I think that's the right team that you need, and the team needs to realise that that's part of your nature, and to try to help you mitigate it. And in my world, I sort of take it back to the core, the fundamental pillars of wellness, and this includes hormonal wellness. Nourish your body, including getting your gut health right. Move your body, but not too much. And most women these days is sort of over-exercise and under-move. Manage your stress, get good quality sleep, and ditch the toxins in any way you can. And if you just do that, then you're going to be far healthier than 99% of the women who are on this journey with you.
I love that.
Thank you.
1000% agree. Yeah, I think that's fantastic advice. Thank you, Erica. The whole anxiety thing is definitely part of it, and we will be having other discussions about that in particular. Around that topic of are women being prescribed the incorrect medication, for example, when something else could be the solution in this time of life with anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
I would love for us to be able to share where you would like women to be directed to get the important health, or to consider perhaps an integrative doctor as part of their team. So
Yes.
where do you suggest women go to, Karen, to get that particular aspect covered off?
Again, and I've changed my advice over many years. I think that the compounding pharmacies in your local area are a really good resource, and they're quite happy to do this. The
Right.
other website that you can use is the Australian College of Nutritional and Environmental Medicine.org, ACNEM.org. And also the AIMA, AIMA, the Australian Integrative Medical Association. I think it's .com.au, but it's the Australian Integrative Medical Association. And they have a list of find your practitioner in your local area. So that can help as well. And then Google them. So that once you've found a name and you think that might be okay, then what I tend to do when I look for practitioners in an area that I'm not familiar with to give advice, I say, what do you call it, bad reviews. And so you see whether, there's got a lot of bad reviews, and often it's not. And you can tell the difference between sometimes a patient needed to wait for 3 weeks before they got their first appointment, and that's not a bad review. But, it's do your Google search on that practitioner. And if you see consistently the same message coming through from a large number of bad reviews, then maybe just move on to the next person on your list.
Red flag.
Yeah.
We've talked very briefly about the book that you have done previously. And we know, inside knowledge, that you are working on another book that will be out next year. I'm looking
Yes.
forward to that release as well. And you also mentioned your retreat. Now, I am leaning more into that space as well. Can we just touch on that briefly? Would you like to share? Do you feel that that's appropriate?
Absolutely. Next Sunday, I'm starting a 5-day retreat at Gwingana. It's basically called Mastering Menopause. So that's focusing on menopause, and it's a women-only retreat. And we don't do that very often at Gwingana, but that's quite exciting. We used to do women-only retreats called Women's Discovery, but that covered, the whole, from 15-year-olds through to 90-year-olds in some cases. So we've narrowed that age frame so that we can look at perimenopause and menopause and really dive deeply down into that. And then next March, I think it's the 24th of March through to the 29th of March, we're going to the French Riviera, south of France, and a little village called Saint-Genès, which is at the back in the hinterland behind Nice. And I'm running a 5-day retreat there for women, and it's a very intimate retreat. I think there's 2 spots left on that one. So it's that's exciting. Because that's my favourite place in the world at the moment. Yeah.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. Erica, I'm going to India in March, so unfortunately I can't join you then. But that would
Need
be
a
on my
French
radar if
pilgrimage.
you're running another one. Yeah. But
Yeah.
Erica, that maybe you should keep that on your radar. You never know. And anyone listening, that's wonderful. Oh, south of France, that sounds beautiful.
Sounds beautiful.
It does. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Karen. There's been a wealth of information in there for women. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us today. And yeah, girls, if you want to look after your midlife health and tap into the world of integrative medicine and get your team together, then please check out the links that we'll put in the show notes that Dr. Karen has mentioned. And anything else you wanted to leave us with, Karen?
Only from the point of view of what's on the horizon with regard to new research on menopause. And there's some really interesting research with regard to the brain changes that happen at menopause that we didn't talk about today because we just didn't have time. But that is opening up another can of worms when we sort of look at how to nurture women through that hormonal change with their brain intact and their cognition really firing.
Is that Lisa Mosconi's work that you're talking about, or something else?
Yes, it is, and it's looking at the work of, and I can't remember what the doctor did, but the Galveston diet. But I'm not a fan particularly of that one. But you know what I mean. It's looking
I do know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah. It's looking at moving into a fat-based a diet rather than a carbohydrate-driven diet, and I'm a fan of that. But I think that things like the Galveston diet just go to too extreme, and you're going to be looking at nutrient deficiencies if you only have 10% of your meal on your plate carbohydrates. So there's a balance there that you have to get that feeds your brain the healthy fats it needs to use as fuel after menopause rather than sugar, but that doesn't leave you with nutrient deficiencies that are going to domino into health issues that move down a different lane. So it's all a matter of balance and getting that information and seeing how you can apply that information safely to your unique circumstances.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you. Erica, have you got anything, darling?
No, thank you so much, Karen. This has been a real treat. Thank you so much for sharing so generously with us as well.
You're welcome. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for Midlife Unfiltered. If you loved this episode, you're going to love what's coming next. Be sure you're subscribed on your platform of choice so you don't miss a thing.
We'd also be delighted, and for sure do a little happy dance, if you took the time to leave us a rating and review. Those not only absolutely make our day, but more importantly, it helps other women who may be wanting something more from their midlife to know about us and to listen in as well. You can connect with us on socials too. You'll find links to connect on LinkedIn, Instagram, and email in the show notes.